Thank you for joining us today. My name is Rich Williamson. I'm a partner at Robertson Johnson, Miller and Williamson in Reno, Nevada. I co-chair this task force with Hillary Fox, who is lead counsel with Allstate Litigation Services out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. The ABA TIPS Law Practice and Legal Department Management Task Force is dedicated to helping you with the business side of running your law practice. Today, we're excited to present the following webinar. The State of U.S. Small Law Firms. How did small law firms close out 2023 and what lies ahead? We would like to thank our co-sponsors for this program, Thomson Reuters, the ABA TIPS Solo and Small Firm Task Force, and the ABA Solo Small Firm and General Practice Division. I would now like to introduce our presenter, William Josten. Bill is the Legal Department Innovations Insight Strategist for the Thomson Reuters Institute. Bill's work focuses primarily on issues of interest to high-level decision makers in the legal market, including law firm managing partners and C-level officers, as well as corporate general counsel. Much of Bill's research and writing focuses on issues related to law firm profitability and strategy, the future of legal business, and law firm client relationships. During his time with Thomson Reuters, Bill has also worked as a pricing and profitability consultant, in account management for large law firms, and as a reference attorney. Prior to joining Thomson Reuters, Bill was an attorney in private practice, an adjunct professor at the University of St. Thomas School of Law, and a law clerk at the Minnesota Court of Appeals. And with that, Bill, I'll turn it over to you.
Rich, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I love doing stuff like this. I think these types of sessions are really fun. It's a chance to be really engaging, share some really good information. I'm seeing more people populate into the meeting, which is awesome. I know we've got about an hour together today. And anyone who's ever seen me present before will tell you I have no problem filling the time that we have available. So that's not going to be an issue. But I did want to say sort of from the jump here that I want this to be I want this to be open. I do have a deck. I haven't shared it yet on purpose because I don't want this to feel like death by PowerPoint. I've got a deck. I've got some slides. I've got an agenda I want to cover. My agenda doesn't necessarily have to be your agenda. I shared with both Rich and Norma prior to the start of the session that I could get through 100 slides in an hour and have accomplished very little of value for you because I'm talking about what matters to me and not what matters to you. Instead, I would much rather start with what I think is going to be important and go down that direction. But I want this to be open. I want this to be something where y'all feel comfortable asking questions. There's a chat feature built into our Zoom here, so you can feel free to send questions through chat. Or frankly, it's a small enough group. If you want to just take yourself off mute and just ask a question at any point, that's great too. I have zero issue with being interrupted. I was sharing before we open the session up that my role within the Thomson Reuters Institute is I am the job title is Legal Marketplace Innovation Strategist, but I actually sort of head up the thought leadership content strategy for the Thomson Reuters Institute, which is the thought leadership arm of our broader enterprise. I head that up for basically all law firms and corporate law departments globally. So far today, I have been working on corporate feedback program or corporate client feedback programs, both clients giving feedback to the law firms and law firms giving feedback to their clients. I've written a report on I guess yesterday I wrote a report on the state of the Australian legal market. Then I had a meeting with a managing partner from a law firm in New Zealand. And I got a call coming up later today with the GC of a Fortune 100 company. So it's kind of all over the place. But all that is to say, if there's something that you're curious about that's not in the deck, it's probably either in my brain or in my laptop somewhere. So please feel free to ask questions, even if you're not sure if they're on topic, because if it's of value to you, it's much more important, or not necessarily important, but probably much more valuable for us to spend some time talking about that. So that's an open invitation to please feel free to take us on a bit of a sidetrack if you think that it's going to be something that that helps move that conversation forward. But with that said, let's start the Death by PowerPoint session of today's presentation. I'll go ahead and share the deck that I have. You'll notice that the slideshow title is slightly different than the title that was shared with the session description. That's a bit by design. The session description that I sent to get people to sign up, I wanted to be fairly descriptive in terms of what we wanted to cover, but this title to me is just a little bit flashier. So that's why I went this way for the session description for the title of today's session. Because really it's the same thing. State of the legal market, or the state of the U.S. small law firms at the end of 2023 and going into 2024, or how small law firms stand in today's market. And the subhead here, a by the numbers look, that's really an area where the Thomson Reuters Institute, I think, specializes. It's something that I'm very proud of that we do, and something that we put a lot of effort into doing. And that is having thought leadership that is very data driven. If you're not familiar with the Thomson Reuters Institute, like I said, we're the thought leadership arm of TR. My job is to listen to the market, what conversations are happening in the market. How can I bring Thomson Reuters perspective to those conversations in a way that is evidence-based and data-driven? And then what does the data and evidence that we look at tell us should be a discussion in the marketplace, but something that maybe isn't a discussion that's happening yet? How can we move that conversation forward in a meaningful way through that type of an exercise? So it's really kind of a push and pull in terms of how we pull this stuff together. This particular report, our State of U.S. Small Law Firms, this was released last fall, and it's a look that we do every year that we're actually interviewing small law firm leaders. So it's 30 lawyers and below in terms of attorney headcount. And we're trying to get to the decision makers and the folks who run the strategy for those law firms to get a sense of how they feel things stand, what their priorities are, what direction they think the market is going. And frankly, the interplay between small law firms and their larger law competitors today is incredibly interesting. We're seeing market dynamics that I've been in this particular role for about 8 years. And I've been a practicing attorney for, 17 years now. There's things going on in the marketplace I've never seen before, despite having studied this very, very closely for the better part of a decade. So it gives us a chance to talk about some really interesting things that are going on in the small law firm space. We're going to talk about that competition between large and small law firms. We're going to look at performance of small law firms. We're going to look at what the future might hold for small law firms. And because you simply can't have a presentation in 2023 or 2024 without talking about generative AI, we're going to talk a little bit about Gen AI and what the future might hold there in terms of the potential for small law firms and how they go to market and how they do business. But that's going to be a later part of the discussion. I don't want to get into the Gen AI stuff too early, because what I've noticed in the marketplace, and this isn't intended to be a criticism, it's just an observation, but I've sort of joked that if a presenter gives a presentation in 2024 and doesn't talk about Gen AI, did they even really give a presentation? It's kind of like if a tree falls in the woods. Well, that's true. I mean, we have to talk about it. You're kind of tone deaf if you don't. But if you lead with that, if that becomes the dominating force in the conversation, it's very easy to lose the plot, as the Brits would say. We can focus so exclusively on the Gen AI stuff and the things that might happen in the future. There's a lot about Gen AI that's a might at this point. It might be this, it might be that. Things might change in this way. It's very easy to focus on the might, and it's easy then to lose sight of what is actually driving things today and what are the problems and the burdens that we need to confront in today's market and think about how we need to do that. The analogy that someone used with me once is there's only room for so many penguins on the iceberg. And the more penguins that we have focused on Gen AI, the fewer penguins we have focused on, demand growth or business generation, business development, rate structures, profitability, all the other things that we have to manage, and the various hats that we have to wear, particularly in the small law space. That's one of the things that is, I think, really unique about the small law space is pretty much everybody in small law is an owner operator. There are a few firms in small law that operate at a scale that sort of punch above their weight, where they've got professional business structures, they've got office managers, they may have I've worked with a few that have a CFO, but it's certainly the exception rather than the rule. For the most part, it's being handled by the people who also have to practice law and sign up the clients and make sure that the checks come in. It's you're wearing all the hats at the same time. So how do we balance that? How do we keep that attention moving forward in a way that is going to be productive for the business? And I think a big part of that, first of all, is understanding sort of what are the challenges that we face today. And I hope that as we move through this deck, you're hearing things that resonate. I say a lot of my job is what I call quantifying emotion. You feel something. Can we put numbers behind that? Because sometimes as we start to quantify that emotion, we realize, okay, what I'm feeling may actually be a little bit off, or it can be validating. What I'm feeling is what a lot of other people are feeling. So at least I can commiserate in that sense. So all that out of the way, and sort of a long exposition there, let's jump into some of the things that we found in our 2023 State of U.S. Small Law Firms report that hopefully will be kind of interesting and give us some guidance for how we want to address where we stand today and where we go tomorrow. First thing to talk about is sort of the challenges that small law firms face. Small law firms face a real and rising burden of administrative work. And there's real pressure to try and help develop business too. So this has been, frankly, this has been a set of issues that we've seen in small law firms really for as long as I've been doing this study. I've been doing this study for 7 years. So some of these things, no real big change. What we saw was 77% of small law firms face at least a moderate challenge from administrative tasks. What's interesting is that administrative burden is now the top challenge for small law firms. It's leapfrogged business development. Business development was historically the sort of the number one challenge that small law firms had identified for themselves. They said that trying to identify new client business is not an easy thing, and certainly it's not. And you can see there historically 2021, 2022, 2023, the number that identified it as a significant challenge or a moderate challenge. What we've seen that's really interesting is not necessarily a decline in the challenge around acquiring new business, but rather a growth in the challenge of spending too much time on administrative tasks. And if you look at that description there, spending too much time on administrative tasks, not enough time practicing law, that latter half is really, really vital. Not enough time practicing law. Frankly, that's what we get paid to do, is practice law. The administrative stuff we can't help. There's no way of getting out of the administrative work. We have to do it. Again, we're owner operators of small law firms, right? But that's not what anybody's paying us to do. What we're being paid to do is practice law and solve client problems. So that challenge of spending too much time on administrative tasks, not enough time practicing law, that's a really significant challenge. And that middle part of the top of the slide there, the administrative burden is now the top challenge. Business development hasn't gotten easier. The administrative burden has grown. That's really true. When we talk to people, not just in the survey, but actually speaking to them in sort of an open context and just gathering what we call ANEC data, and talking to them about business development really hasn't gotten any easier. Marketing your firm, trying to find new clients and win new matters, that's still a very, very challenging proposition. Where we see it declining, you'll notice that from 22 to 23, there's a 1 percentage point difference. And that's 1% fewer said that it was a significant challenge. So statistically insignificant. Even the shift from 21 to 22, that is less of a recognition that, hey, business development got easier for us during that period. That is the penguins. That's really what that comes down to, is that's the penguins moving around on the iceberg. More burden was being placed on the administrative side. We had fewer penguins paying attention to the biz dev side. That's really what happened. And where's that challenge from spending too much time on administrative tasks coming from? Well, I think we can all relate to that. The idea of managing staff, having to manage real estate resources, managing our own vendor contracts, all of that falls into our laps. And that has certainly not gotten any easier. To a certain extent, technology can alleviate some of that burden, right? There's certain things that technology can do to make that easier for us. On the other side, having to learn the technology, adopt the technology, evaluate and purchase the technology, that creates a new element of that administrative burden, right? And frankly, that's an area where we're not necessarily as a profession as well equipped to deal with it. We're not tech people. Larger law firm competitors that we stand against, they have the ability to have literally teams of people dedicated to this stuff. That administrative burden is really something where it's it's a tremendous time suck that we can't necessarily do a lot about, at least in the short term. And it's very, very easy to let the tactical interfere with the strategic. And I'll explain what I mean about that a little bit more in just a second. But we also saw a big jump in cost control and expense growth as a challenge in 2023. You can see how that really came to the fore, where we went from 45% saying it was a moderate challenge to 54% saying it was at least a moderate challenge in 2023. I think we can all relate to that just from the way that the basic economy has functioned, right? We all probably felt that in one respect or another. Local economic conditions, that makes it really hard. People are maybe a little more hesitant to pay for lawyers because, frankly, for a lot of the clients that we're serving, those individual consumers, if the price of the pump is higher, if the price of eggs and bread is higher, and we know that that's true for everybody, they may be less willing to take on the cost of hiring a lawyer. They may be putting off legal issues. There's certain things that those individual consumers are thinking and feeling that cascades into the law firm. It hurts us from a revenue perspective. That hurts us from a profit perspective because it makes it harder to meet those expenses. We also see our own cost of doing business going up. The things that we need to buy just to keep our offices running, that's going up. Cost of real estate has gotten pretty expensive. So firms are having to make some pretty hard decisions about a brick and mortar presence. There's something to be said for having an office as a lawyer, right? That there's obviously a need for that, but at the same time, it incurs a fairly large cost burden. Labor costs have gone up. Everything has gone up. So this idea of cost control and expenses being a major concern, that is not new to us. In fact, we tend to see these types of spike and fall challenges in the history of this State of the Legal Market report for small law firms. The last one that I saw was in 2020. We saw a big spike in concern around law firms getting paid by their clients. Again, 2020, challenging economic times. There was a lot of government economic assistance. So that ended up being a challenge that firms were able to mitigate. But the economic reality of running a law firm is always going to be a challenge, and it's manifesting itself this way in 2020 through this cost control. A few thoughts on this. One, it's important to understand what these challenges are so we can start to strategize for them and we can keep them top of mind. We've talked about the administrative burden a little bit. We talked about the control, the expenses stuff. Keeping that balance. We have to balance managing those things with our ability to practice law, right? Because if we can't practice law, then how do we make money? How do we generate the revenue? Balancing those challenges, it can be a function, I mentioned before, a function of balancing the consideration between the strategic and the tactical. I said that before. Well, what on earth do I mean by that? The strategic is looking at the long-term solution for the problem. How do we actually address these issues in a way that is going to make them not as big of a problem going forward? The tactical is, what do I have to do to keep the lights on and the doors open today? So if you think about it in terms of a strategic plan, you may have a 30, 60, 90-day strategic plan that then, 30, 60, 90-day, 1, 3, and 5 year in terms of what you want to do with your firm and your business. That's great. It's important to have that so you have a direction. Our general manager of small law firms, Mark Haddad, has done a whole series on the importance of strategic planning for small law firms. So I encourage you to go out, just Google Mark Haddad. It's Mark with a K and then Haddad. And his series will pop up. If you Google Mark Haddad, Thomson Reuters, it'll come right up and you'll be able to find that series. It's a great series of thought around the importance of strategic planning for small law firms and how to do it. It's kind of a step-by-step guide. But none of that matters if we can't handle the day-to-day. That tends to take primacy and very understandably so. So when we talk about this administrative burden being the top challenge, well, it's hard to handle that strategically when we're dealing with it tactically on a day-to-day basis. And I can give you an example from my own practice, something that frankly, I wish I would have done differently. But at the last firm that I was at before I left practice and came to TR, the process of opening a file. So we had a client come in for a meeting, they signed the retainer agreement, they wrote us a check. We now have to open the file and do the things we need to do to make this client our own. That process was a 1-hour process for every client. It was incredibly burdensome. I worked at a criminal defense firm, so we had to figure out who's the prosecutor on the case, who's the assigned judge. We had to file the cert of rep and get all the case matter numbers and everything filled out. I mean, pulling all that information, it's tedious. It's not impossible. It just takes a while. There are ways, and even 15 years ago when I was last in practice, there were ways to automate a lot of that. If I was to take a lot of that information, plug it into an Excel spreadsheet, have that Excel spreadsheet tied to a mail merge form document in Microsoft Word, I would have one source of truth in terms of my client's case information, their name, their case number, the charges, the prosecutor, the judge, all that stuff in one source of truth in something as simple as an Excel spreadsheet. That can then talk to Microsoft Word. I can generate the letters, and it would take 15, 20 minutes instead of an hour or more. But taking the time out of a workday to do that, to build that, building something like that would take 2 or 3 workdays worth of effort. 20 to 30 hours probably of time to build that in a way that it's going to be functional going forward. Is that worth it? Absolutely. Because my firm was opening 30 to 40 files a month. So 20 to 30 hours of effort literally pays off in a month and a half in terms of the time savings and the capacity that we've created to do things smarter by alleviating some of that administrative burden. But how do you find the 20 to 30 hours that it takes to do that? I actually started that process. I tried to get that project running at my firm. I started to build the mail merge documents. We had the form letters and everything. So I started trying to build the mail merge and build an Excel spreadsheet and make this workable for the firm. Every time I'd start working on it, I'd get pulled in a different direction. It's that day-to-day tactical bounce around that you have to deal with. And that's what makes these types of strategic considerations very difficult to deal with. And that's true at any business and any size law firm. It's a fact of life. But that doesn't really relieve the necessity of making time for something like that. And frankly, that difficulty of balancing the strategic and the tactical is why you see such a large consistency on some of these challenges. Now, I only pulled the top 3 challenges from this report. There's a lot longer list of challenges that law firms reported to us. I just pulled the top 3 for 2023 to put in this deck. If you go back through the history of this report, I'll pick on challenges acquiring new client business, our biz dev challenges. That has perennially been the number 1 or number 2 challenge since we started this report in 2016. So we know business development is always a challenge. What's surprising is how little it's addressed, how little we've seen that shift over time. It's easy to see that as being critical of small law firms. This is a problem. Why aren't you doing anything about it? Well, I understand why you're not. I mean, like I said, I've been in your shoes. I've been there and had to balance that. Okay, I could either fix a business development problem, or I could take the next client meeting and have somebody write me a check that's going to bring revenue in so I can keep the lights on over my head. I know which side of that equation is going to win every day. But it doesn't mean that addressing those challenges isn't important and doesn't bear fruit. And I'll give you an example of how addressing those challenges, making it a priority, can have a positive impact. I talked before about the concern in 2020 about getting paid by clients. Well, we saw a lot of small law firms jump forward and say, okay, not only do I have a plan, but I have implemented a plan to address this particular challenge. And that became a concern in typically March of 2020 when COVID lockdown started. By September, when we conducted the survey, they not only had formulated a plan, they'd implemented one. When we look at the results for a lot of these other things, administrative burdens, business development challenges, we tend to see every year a small number of people saying, okay, we've implemented a plan to make this better. We see a fair number of people saying we have a plan, but we haven't yet implemented it. And then another population that says, we don't have a plan or we don't know how to handle it. What has been interesting, and this is where I sort of encourage everybody on this call, if you identify either these challenges or other challenges within your firm and you know it's something you need to address, make sure you follow through, because having a plan is not the same thing as acting on that plan. For as long as I've been looking at this data, I can assure you, I have not seen a correlation between, so I'll make up numbers here. 2021, we had 75% of people saying that challenges acquiring a new client business were at least a moderate to significant challenge. We had probably 30% of the respondents, I'll make that number up, but we'll say 30% of the respondents say, I have a plan to address this, I haven't yet implemented it. I don't see a 30% difference between the 2021 and 2022 numbers, such that they implemented a plan in a way that it's no longer a challenge to them. I would hazard a guess that a lot of the people who said they had a plan, they did, but the plan didn't get implemented. It's very similar to my client intake story. I had a plan. I knew exactly what I needed to do. I never actually did it. So that's sort of my takeaway from the first slide here, is really looking at that and saying, okay, how do we move into the area where is a challenge becomes it's a challenge that we've at least started to address. It's a difficult question, but it's one that I think is really, really vital. Sorry, I forgot what my next slide was, so I had to take a quick peek. But that I think is a really important point of the State of U.S. small law firms today. I'm going to encourage you, there's a link at the end of this deck to go out and download the whole report. Go out and download that report, because it's going to give you a larger list of the challenges, but frankly, the challenges that the market as a whole is facing, less important than the challenges you at your firm are facing. So sort of my takeaway on this first slide, be very honest with yourself about the challenges that you're facing and how you're doing addressing them. If you don't have a plan, that's totally fine. You're a busy person. You've got a lot to do, but rank them in order of priority. Treat it like Robinson Crusoe pulling items off the ship, if I could use a literary reference. Address them in the order of most important. You know, if that ship washes off the reef tomorrow, what do I have to make sure I get off of it today? What are the things that are borderline existential burdens for me? Cost control, huge on that list, right? Not getting paid by clients, huge on that list. Because if I'm spending too much money or not bringing money in the door, boy, I'm going to have a hard time keeping my law firm as a going concern, right? But be honest about what those challenges are, be honest about what your plan for them is, and then figure out how we're going to implement that plan. And that's where I think the stuff that Mark has written on strategic planning is really, really important. So that's a lot of doom and gloom. That's a lot of, boy, we've got a lot of challenges, a lot of things that we're facing for problems, and we haven't done a great job of addressing them. Is there any positive news? Well, yeah, actually there is. There's quite a bit of positive news. And it starts here. Clients are looking to shift work to save costs, but also preserve quality. And here I'm shifting from sort of our typical individual consumer clients and looking more at corporate clients. But that's an important consideration, because there's so much money at play from our corporate clients. When we look at how demand is shifting, when I talk about demand, I talk about what I'm talking about there is a metric that we look at where it's total billable hours worked and put into WIP, work in progress at the average law firm. We have a tool within Thomson Reuters called Financial Insights. It's plugged into the financial management systems of about 220 law firms globally. Now, it doesn't get down into what I would really consider the small law firm space, because frankly, the types of financial management systems that we need to interface with to be able to map metrics aren't very common in small law firms. You know, where small law firms were more often looking at QuickBooks and Intuit and those types of things for accounting systems, or you're maybe using an off-site accountant that's doing more of your bookkeeping and your financial management, and perfectly reasonable, understandable, but not a system that we can easily interface with. But what I've noticed is that a lot of what we see in terms of mid-sized law firm trends tends to trickle down into the small law firm space, particularly as it relates to mid-sized favorability drivers and mid-sized preferences on the part of corporate clients. So as we look at this, one of the things we noticed even last year was demand growth. We saw a shift from high cost to low cost firms. And the gray bars here are high cost firms. And I'm looking at the upper left, what's labeled as figure 23. That's figure 23 out of our 2023 state of the law or state of the legal market report. I'm still using this figure though, because it still holds true. We've seen work shifting towards lower cost firms and away from higher cost firms. What those numbers looked like in 2023 was, you can see the statistics here, negative 3.2% overall demand for higher cost firms, 0.6% demand growth for lower cost firms. So work very actively shifting from higher priced firms to lower cost firms. So anybody with a cost advantage can stand to benefit from this. What was really interesting, where you see the blue and the red bars there, the blue bars, or the blue bar represents the average for the mid-sized law firm in our data sample. So the average demand growth for the mid-sized law firm. The orange bar is lower than, or the orange bar on the bar chart is lower than the blue line. The gray bar, those high cost law firms, is actually deeper, in a deeper hole than the red line, which is average demand growth for the AmLaw 100 at the time that we did this comparison. So high cost firms are performing worse than the average AmLaw 100 firm. Low cost firms aren't performing as well as the average mid-sized law firm. That was really interesting. We wanted to dig into why is that? And by the way, the little table over there, we broke down kind of segment-wise how high cost and low cost broke down. High cost does not universally mean AmLaw 100. Low cost does not universally mean mid-size. Predominantly, yes, but we did see mid-size law firms in that high cost breakdown, and we did see AmLaw 100 firms in that low cost breakdown. So you can kind of take some of those preconceived perceptions and set them aside a little bit, even though generally speaking, the trend holds true. But so why the difference between where the blue line sits in the orange bar and the red line sits in the gray bar? And really it came down to specialization. They were not only looking for cost, but this is where you see in that headline, they were looking to preserve quality. They want specialization. They want expertise. This has grown throughout the course of 2024. We actually saw a shift in buyer favorability drivers. We conduct interviews with about 2,000, maybe 2,200 corporate general counsel on an annual basis. And one of the things we ask them is, how do you decide which law firms you want to use? What makes you prefer one law firm over another? Cost is certainly a factor. We're going to get into that in just a second. But it's also their specialism, their area of expertise. Corporate law departments view themselves as a Swiss Army knife. They're able to do a little bit of a lot of things, and they do it pretty well. When they need to reach for outside counsel, what they really need is that specialty tool. It's not enough to just have a hammer, but they need that new. I'm a bit of a DIYer, and I have a huge toolbox. So it's not just a claw hammer, but it's a pneumatic palm air hammer that will allow me to fit in between the joists on my deck to drive a nail where I don't have the space to swing a hammer. It's a specialized tool. It's not something everybody's going to have in their toolbox. So that raises a bit of an interesting question. How do you present yourself as that expert? I don't know the answer to that question. It's going to be different for everybody. But in terms of takeaways, that's another takeaway that I want to offer. And that's a key takeaway from this slide is when you're talking to clients, if you're trying to win business, especially corporate business, don't just talk about your cost. Talk about what's unique to you. What is your area of specialty or your area of special expertise that only you can do? And that's not necessarily, oh, well, I'll knock 10% off my hourly rate. Anybody can do that. You're just competing on price. It's what's unique to you. What experience do you bring? What expertise do you bring? And frankly, whether you're talking to an individual consumer client or a business client, that same type of standout preference is going to make a difference. And think about it even in your own buying decisions. You may at certain times go for just the cheapest thing on the shelf. And in certain circumstances, that's what you need. But there are other times, the example I've used in the past is macaroni and cheese. There's all kinds of macaroni and cheese brands out there. A lot of them are cheaper than Kraft mac and cheese. My kids, they want the Kraft. And frankly, for the extra 50 cents you spend on the box, it's probably worth it. But I'm not buying just based on price. There's a value proposition there. The taste is better, or the texture is better, or whatever you want to talk about. For me, my kids won't eat the cheaper stuff. So I can buy it, but it doesn't deliver anything for me because the kids won't eat it. And who's buying mac and cheese if not for the sake of feeding your kids? Although I have to admit, the idea of making a box of mac and cheese sounds really good to me right now that I'm talking about it. But there's a quality difference there. There's something unique about that blue box product that draws me to it, even at a bit of a price premium. So that's one of the things I really want to encourage you to think about is what's unique to you, that you not only fit into the low cost of what the client's looking for, but you fit into that specialization and expertise. But when I talk about clients looking for those low cost firms, I don't want to belittle that point. We've seen a big shift in clients expressing that. Figure 18 in the upper right, that's from a report we just released about 2 weeks ago, our State of the U.S. small law, or State of the U.S. legal market for 2024. And there's a couple of things in here that I want to point out. One in particular, and that's if you look about a third of the way up, move work to lower cost firms at 50%. The question that they're answering is here, which of the following will form a significant part of your cost control strategy in the coming 12 months? This is a question that we're asking to corporate general counsel. This idea of moving work to lower cost firms, we've seen GCs saying to us, I'm going to move work around. I'm going to realign my portfolio of work. We're going to reevaluate the law firms we work with. They've said stuff like that for years. This language of moving work to lower cost firms, that is new verbiage. That is not the way that they've expressed this before. Even in 2023, they talked about moving work around. They talked about rejiggering their portfolio. They didn't talk about lower cost firms. Now, figure 23, that's us looking at the numbers. We did our own slice of data to say, okay, we see demand moving. Where are they moving it to? We ran 10 or 15 different iterations to try and figure out where work was moving. And one of them was low cost versus high cost. The clients weren't telling us to look for that. In 2024, the clients are telling us to look for that. So even what I was just saying about having that unique value proposition, you still like that cost advantage is definitely an advantage in buyers' eyes. If you really want to try and corner the market, though, if you really want to try and address some of that business development challenge we were talking about on the previous slide, finding a way to marry up the value proposition of what's unique to you along with the cost advantage, that's really where you're going to be finding a sweet spot and being able to compete meaningfully for new business going forward in 2024 and addressing that challenge that we saw in 2023 and beyond. If you're on par with every other law firm and you look like a generic small law firm, not that there really is such a thing, but if in the eyes of the client, there's just a generic small law firm, your price advantage may be good, but it might not be as good as the price advantage of the firm down the street. But if you have a price advantage over their prior firm and you can highlight your particular area of expertise, it could be a geographic specialty, it could be a practice area specialty, it could be someone in your firm, we're going to help you with this regulatory matter. Oh, and by the way, the former head of that agency didn't want to go work for Big Law. He now works for me. Or, the one of the top people in the state agency who handles these same issues. Take an environmental issue. Former senior manager at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency works for my law firm and handles these issues. That's something nobody else can replicate. And that's a really great way to sort of corner some of that. And frankly, I know I'm talking a lot about corporate client business here. There's a lot of it out there to grab. There's a lot of money to be made because we see, again, that shift of that desire to shift work down to lower cost firms. And if you look at the bottom right, small law firms are holding their own with large law clients. The number one segment of law firms doing litigation work for the Fortune 50 is firms with between 2 and 5 lawyers. That's a trend that I've been watching for years. And frankly, the first time I saw it, it kind of surprised me because you sort of operate under an assumption that, well, big business is doing work with big law firms. And to a certain extent, that's true, but it's far from universally true. The big law, so firms with 500 or more lawyers, their share of Fortune 50 litigation peaked in 2020, and it's been trending down. In 2020, they handled about 38.5% of Fortune 50 litigation. In 2023, that number was 17%. So basically half. That was all picked up by primarily small and mid-sized law firms. Some solos, a lot of 2 to 15s, and some 15 to 40s. That's just the way the particular data set that I'm looking at there. That's the way those firms break down. I'm not making them up out of thin air. It's just that's what the data set breaks them down at. A little bit arbitrary, probably, but that's just where it comes in. But still, the idea of work flowing to smaller law firms, it's absolutely happening, and clients want it to be happening more. So if you're in a practice area where you have the ability to serve some of those bigger clients, it's definitely time to lean into that. They're looking. And the best thing that you can do is, well, first of all, when you win that work, turn that client into an evangelist because they talk. I have seen, like I said, I work on both the buy and the sell side of this equation. And I have sat on numerous panels where GCs will say, oh, well, we've been realigning our portfolio this way. And somebody in the audience will say, well, who are you using for that? And next thing you know, they're throwing out names of not just law firms, but individual lawyers. Oh, we're using so-and-so based out of Kansas City. They're amazing. Oh, we found this firm in Rochester, Minnesota. That's an honest example that I heard. We found this firm in Rochester, Minnesota that does just amazing work for us. That was one of the top insurance companies in the world. And they're sending IP work to a firm in Rochester, Minnesota that's got, I think, 14 lawyers. And they love them. And they're in front of a room of 50 other GCs talking about that firm. If you can get into that position, wow. But it's a function, again, of what's unique to you plus the cost advantage, and then really developing a relationship with that client so that they know how much you value them and they see how hard you work for them. That's what they're going to want to talk about, is the value that they're getting from you and how you're delivering for them. That feeds into this idea too, that the situation for small law firms, the overall situation has small law firms optimistic. When we talk to small law firm leaders in our State of U.S. small law firm survey, we ask them, how do you expect certain metrics to perform over the next 3 to 5 years, or next 1 year, 3 year, 5 years? Across the board, they're expecting to see growth in things like revenue per lawyer, demand for services, profits per lawyer. They see this as a potential boom time. And I think that's one. I think that's absolutely true, and I think it's backed up by the data. It's something that firms can capture. Again, striking that balance between the strategic and the tactical. If you can carve out the time to focus on the strategic, don't just think about what is this taking away from me in the next hour or two. Think about what is the payoff for this down the road. Again, my example of client intake. If I would have taken 20 hours to put into building the client intake system that we needed, it wouldn't have been anything robust. It wouldn't have been anything super complicated, but the amount of time it would have saved me I would have gotten that back in a month or less. So the ROI on that would have been massive, and it never happened. But when we see the potential for growth, there's all the incentive in the world to drive towards some of those things. But we also have to be mindful of some of the risks. We do see some potential risks out there. General economic pressure, we've talked a little bit about that. Sluggish local economies, again, very relatable, especially for firms that rely on individual consumer clients. You're going to feel that. And so how do you address that? How can you find ways to strategically combat that? And that's a conversation I'm certainly open to having on a one-on-one basis. Trying to get to know the firm a little bit, know the practices, know the clientele a little bit, because the strategies to address that are really going to vary based on the individual firm and the individual circumstance. And then also late payment by clients. We saw that jump again in 23. We saw it jump in 20. We saw it jump again in 23. That's a function of the other two risks that we're seeing, that the economic pressures and the sluggish economy. We're worried about clients being able to pay. So how do we confront that? Well, it's making sure, like what we saw in 2020, the solutions that firms implemented, it was making sure that we're invoicing clients in a timely fashion. Maybe it's increasing the amount that we keep on retainer from clients, as opposed to working on an invoice basis. We want to invoice against retainer as opposed to invoicing just against their checkbook, because then we've already got the money in the trust account. A big thing that we saw in 2020 was firms starting to take credit cards. I was amazed at the number of law firms that didn't take credit cards in 2020. If your firm's not taking credit cards today, I really got to wonder why. With something like a Square reader being as cheap as it is and as easy to implement, it seems like a no-brainer solution. If it's something you're not doing already, that's a great way to make sure you're getting paid. One thing that I've seen firms starting to turn to increasingly is other forms of cashless payments. So Venmo, Cash App. If you're not taking Venmo or Cash App, it's something I would very strongly encourage you to consider. And interestingly enough, I would set up an account with Venmo, Zelle, and Cash App. Cover everything that you can in terms of those, PayPal as well. you will see cultural differences in how those are used. It's really fascinating to me. Um, Older folks, baby boomers that do all their stuff, they're maybe comfortable doing things through their banking app. I bank through Wells Fargo. I have a Wells Fargo app on my phone. The money transfer app that's built into the Wells Fargo app is Zelle. So I have Zelle set up. Some of my friends use PayPal. Other friends use Cash App. Other friends use Venmo. I have accounts for all three because then I can work with whoever. Interestingly, there are cultural differences. If you've never looked into this, there are cultural differences in who uses Cash App versus who uses Venmo. Cash App tends to be more prevalent in communities of color, Black families, Hispanic families, for whatever reason. I couldn't explain it to you, but they tend to use Cash App. So it's more inclusive if you broaden that net. So this idea of getting late payment by client, there are definitely solutions, and try and be very comprehensive, inclusive, and encompassing in how you approach that, because it can really help. The other thing to think about with late payment by client is timeliness. Make sure if you're doing stuff on the hourly basis and having to invoice clients, make sure you are timely. There's a long time concern over an inability to accurately account for time if you're not entering it contemporaneously. Well, clients are getting more and more troubled about late invoices. If they're seeing time coming in anything beyond a month after it was worked. So if you work it in January, enter it, work it in January, bill it in February, because they don't want to see January time billed in March. The longer time sits stagnant, the less likely it is to get paid. So for those types of things, that's what we saw in 2020 is people really doubled down on their cash collection efforts and got more creative in how they were able to accept payment. And it really helped. We saw a big turnaround there. So that's what I would encourage when you look at some of those potential risks in 2024 now around late payment and economic pressures. Make it easy for you, make it easy to do business with you. Have a payment portal incorporated into your website, your law firm website. And frankly, with Zelle, Venmo, Cash App, Square, PayPal, those are easy. Those are links that you can embed right into your site. Pay your invoice here. It doesn't have to be a super complicated process, but the easier you make it for somebody to give you money, the more likely they are to probably give it to you. The other thing that I would point out is small firms need to recognize the need to improve internal processes. We've talked about this a lot, the administrative burden, but law firms recognize this as well. 35% of small law firms say that improving internal efficiency is among their top 3 goals. That's the administrative stuff, right? We got to improve those internal processes. It's my client intake example. How do I improve that? That's a big priority for me. 35% say it's among their top 3 goals. Generative AI, I told you we'd get to the generative AI portion of today's presentation. Generative AI is going to play a big role in this. 72% of small law firms reported to us, and this was several months ago, so that number is probably significantly higher. 72% reported that they were at least aware of generative AI. Whether that's ChatGPT or Bard or Bing, or there's other tools called Harvey or Microsoft Copilot. Whatever tool it is, there's a ton of them out there. 72%, probably more than that, are aware of generative AI, even if they haven't used it. And 40% of small law firm lawyers in particular see at least some opportunity for it to help improve current processes. Absolutely true. I don't know if this application is viable yet, but again, putting it in the context of my client intake, I'm sitting there and interviewing a client, and I don't want to be, typing things into a computer and not paying attention to my client when I'm doing an intake interview. I want to be invested in that potential client because I'm trying to get them to sign up and write a check for me, right? That's the goal here, right? So I want to be paying attention to them. Well, is there an AI tool that could take, I'm still taking notes. Could an AI tool take my notes, pull the necessary information out of my notes, input it into the tools that I use for the acronym for it is CRM, my customer relationship management tool, whether that's my Excel spreadsheet or whatever else? Could Copilot or ChatGPT or whatever pull that out, populate some of the fields in those documents for me, and then generate the documents that I need for file opening? Absolutely. If I'm having a virtual meeting with a client where we're talking through details of their case, we actually do this already with a lot of the meetings in TR. We'll run a transcript on the meeting. I know I saw a note earlier that someone's closed captioning this presentation. So there's going to be a transcript of this presentation, which by the way, I'm totally cool with. That's great. Um, but you could throw that transcript into Copilot or ChatGPT and say, summarize this for me and tell me the key points. And it'll do it. So if you're having a Zoom meeting or some sort of a virtual meeting with your client, run a transcript on it. Now there's confidentiality issues and there's other things you'd want to make sure that you did from an ethical standpoint so that you weren't having any sort of confidentiality challenges there. But assuming that you can get those addressed, you have the transcript of the meeting, ask Bing, hey, by the way, can you summarize this for me? Have Bing, or there are other tools that can be you can be using to help with document review. I know doing discovery review was just a tremendous pain in the butt for me when I was in practice. A lot of that can be streamlined now. So when we look at the opportunity to improve current processes in generative AI, they absolutely exist. And in fact, I'll point to some of the work that Mark Haddad has done as well here. He did a whole series on the potential that generative AI holds for small law firms, and he sees it, and he makes a very compelling argument for this, as a great way to level the playing field between small law firms and their larger competitors. One of the things that small law firms just simply don't have is bench strength. You don't have a team of finance professionals and a team of marketing professionals and a team of operations professionals. A lot of that, though, can be leveled out through very strategic deployment of AI. So using AI to help manage your billing process, make sure that you're keeping up to date on your docketing, that you're not missing calendar docket or docket calendar entries, or deadlines for clients. I talked about the memos to file and things like that. There's lots of ways that can help small law firms improve scale. I know one of the things we're working on internally here is using better AI tools to help small law firms more effectively market, to figure out. Mark uses the phrase, you catch the fish in the ponds you fish in. And that's absolutely true. You're going to capture the market that you're advertising to. I'm constantly amused. I listen to Pandora a lot, and I'm constantly amused when an ad in Spanish comes on. I used to be somewhat conversational in Spanish, but I am clearly not the target demographic for that particular ad. So that is an ad that's not particularly well targeted. I really don't know what the ad was about. So it's an advertising effort that's wasted. They're fishing in the wrong pond. Using AI tools to target that pond more effectively. That's the type of thing that we're working on and trying to develop. So thinking about those types of things, capabilities that you don't have today, but Gen AI may be able to bring the capacity for. When we look at generative AI and the attitudes around it, like I said, there's a high degree of awareness. 75, 80% of lawyers are aware of it, probably even more than that, truthfully. 80% think that it could be applied to work within their law firm, and even to legal work. You see that number plummet when you ask them, should it be applied to legal work? So that's why we're not talking a lot about the actual legal work. I'm not saying, use Gen AI. We're not going to the example of the lawyer who's going to use Gen AI to write their brief and they're just going to sign it and turn it in. We've seen that example. It doesn't work very well. But share an example, a small law firm, family law lawyer out of Dallas, 5-lawyer firm. Guy's been doing this for 35 years. He knows his stuff. He decided, well, I'm just going to see what ChatGPT can do. He bought the subscription to ChatGPT 4.0. It's fairly cheap. And the query that he gave it was, what are good questions to ask in a request for discovery for a business valuation, a marriage dissolution in Texas? I mean, he's done hundreds of these over his career. He's like, I'll just see what they come up with. Some of the stuff was stuff that he already had. Like, I've been asking that question for years. Some of it was complete garbage. There were a couple of questions, though, that he'd never thought to ask. It became a brainstorming tool for him. It was really, really interesting. And so he said, it's not anything I'm ever going to rely on to take my place or do the work that my associate would do or whatever, but to use it as a brainstorming tool or an extra set of hands just to think differently about something, absolutely there's value in that. So when we look at the future of what Gen AI may hold, that's really going to be, I think, a huge area of potential is as a brainstorming partner, as a scale partner, and as a capacity builder, being able to bring some expertise in-house that you wouldn't otherwise necessarily have the team size to do. I haven't seen anything come through the chat yet But almost to the top of the hour, I did want to leave a few minutes at least if there's question and answers. There's a QR code. I'll hold up my phone. There's a QR code on the screen here. You can scan that. It'll take you to the Thomson Reuters Institute page. Our State of U.S. small law firms report is there. Our State of the U.S. legal market report is there. The various series from Mark Haddad that I've talked about, they're all listed there. So the strategic planning series, the small law AI series, there's a ton of great follow-up information that you can work through at your leisure through that tr.com/institute, or just scan the code and your mobile will take you right there. But if there are any questions in the last couple of minutes, I'm happy to entertain them.
Bill, one question. In the slide that you had about small law firms seeing opportunities, both opportunities and risks. Yep,
This one.
or I think even the one there one, exactly. One that I noticed or one I guess I thought of that struck me, I know we're dealing with it, and I didn't know if you'd seen any data from other small law firms, is this conflict between, yes, there's an opportunity for lower cost, kind of capturing a larger segment of the market. But I guess the countervailing issue is kind of wage inflation that small law firms are seeing. I know with my law firm, we've got 10 lawyers, and that's always a struggle, is trying to match. We certainly want the talent of the best talent. And so trying to kind of match wages with some of the larger law firms.
Right.
And that's difficult to square with the downward price pressure. So I didn't know if you'd seen any trends in that area or had any data on that.
Yeah, well, and unfortunately, that's a recurring issue now, right? Because we're seeing the New York firms deciding that the exorbitant salaries that they were paying their people in November were suddenly insufficient in December.
Right.
So they decided to do raises again. The effect that that's going to have in the market, I think, it remains to be seen. I'm not entirely sure. My best guess is that the current uptick in salaries in large law firms will not translate the way that it did in 2021. And the big reason for that is in 2021, we saw law firms, the larger law firms, increasing their hiring and increasing salaries. So they were raising the bar for everybody and actively hiring. I mean, I was talking to small law firms in Greenville, South Carolina, and Tucson, Arizona, among other places, that were losing associates to New York firms. I mean, probably the most ridiculous example I saw was a firm in Perth, Australia, where one of their top M&A people got hired away by a New York law firm. Didn't move, just started making New York money working in Perth. I said to the managing partner of that law firm, like, well, the bad news is that person's gone. The good news is they'll be back, because they're not being brought in because they're partner track. They're cannon fodder. Just speaking very candidly, they were surge hiring in 2021. What we see in those larger firms now is they're actually reducing headcount. If you go and look at the State of U.S. small law firms report that we released last week, or not, sorry, the State of the U.S. legal market report we released last week. If you look at the AmLaw 50, the ones that are driving these salary increases, they were actually underwater in terms of their lawyer headcount. So if we set January of 2023 as a baseline, by August 2023, they had fewer lawyers working at the firm in August than they did in January. And then they engaged in their regular September hiring, but they're still not really on par with their average headcount growth. So yes, they're paying more, but they're not actively recruiting the way they were. So that pull of salaries is very different. And frankly, there's a much stronger argument to be made on the part of small law firms to say, no, I'm not getting on that particular merry-go-round right now, because, I mean, Skadden, Cravath, Davis, Milbank, they can only hire so many people. And in fact, they're only going to hire so many people. And the odds of it being the bulk of your associates are really low. So it's difficult too, because you get media outlets. I'll pick on Above the Law because they like to pick on you all as well, where it's like, if you're not matching salaries, what's wrong with you? Well, I'll say from the standpoint of a legal market journalist myself, as well as a former practicing lawyer, what business do you have matching that type of salary? Right? You're not commanding their type of rates. You're not in those types of market structures in terms of your expenses for the most part. I mean, you may be in an office in Midtown Manhattan and you're dealing with the same types of real estate costs that Skadden is, but for the most part, you're in an entirely different economic plane. So you can account for that, to be polite. I know that there are lingering effects from 2021. What I expect to see happen, and I could be wrong about this, but what I expect to see happen is we track what we call direct expense growth, which is like non-partner attorney salary and benefits. We saw that through most of 2021 and 2022, driven by two factors: increasing salary and benefits costs and increasing headcount. The salary and benefits costs really sort of bake themselves into the cake. We look at that on a rolling 12-month basis, and we haven't seen even the AmLaw 200 and for sure mid-sized making a lot of adjustments in that area, in the compensation area, over the last 15 months or so. So direct expense drivers in the mid-size space in particular are much more closely aligned to headcount growth. The AmLaw 50 and even the AmLaw 100, they're putting themselves back in a position for a two-factor driver for at least the next 12 to 14 months because they keep raising salaries. What I will say about mid-sized hiring trends, though, is mid-sized law firms are very aggressively hiring associates right now. They're up like their average associate population is up almost like 15% relative to a year or two ago. Frankly, they have leverage problems. You know, they're sort of an inverted pyramid in a certain sense, where, you know, I use example. It's not uncommon to find a 120 lawyer law firm where 60 of them are partners. That's really hard from a succession planning standpoint and a leverage standpoint, because where does that work go as the boomers start to retire? So we're seeing some pretty aggressive hiring of associates in mid-size, but not at New York scale salaries. They're not clawing salaries back. That's a bad look. But they're also not saying, well, gee, New York is doing this, we've got to keep up. I mean, I got phone calls, like I said, I got phone calls from Perth and Sydney in the days following the latest round of increases saying, are we going to have to match this? And my answer to him was, well, that's entirely up to you. You're not going to have to. You didn't have to before. Whether you choose to is up to you. But they're not going to be pulling the talent away the way that they were 2 years ago.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have today. But we want to again recognize all of our sponsors, of course, Thomson Reuters, the ABA TIPS Law Practice and Legal Department Management Task Force, the ABA TIPS Solo and Small Firm Task Force, and the ABA Solo Small Firm and General Practice Division. Most importantly, Bill, Josten, I want to thank you for a wonderful and terrific program, and hope everyone has a good rest of your day.
Thank you all.